Well, please bear with me here. Obviously, we had lunch. We'll do our next presentation here. It's a 4-part presentation, the 15 years of Ninemile Basin remediation at Bunker Hill Superfund site. It's, as I said, it's divided into 4 parts. I'll introduce all of the speakers, and then the speakers will hand off to each other as they proceed. So one of the speakers is Kyle Richards. He's a senior program manager with the Coeur d'Alene Trust. Kyle is as I mentioned, he's a senior program manager. He's responsible for programmatic planning, budgeting, and management of remedial actions in operable Unit 3 of the Bunker Hill Superfund site. Mr. Richards earned his Bachelor of Science in General Engineering with the civil option from Montana Tech, Go Diggers, and his 15-year career has focused on design and management of large-scale Superfund remediation projects in Montana and Idaho. Another speaker associated is going to be Alan Hughes. He's a principal geologist with Maul, Foster, and Alongi, with, sorry on the pronunciation there, with a Bachelor of Science in Geology from the University of Washington. His 25-year-plus career at MFA includes abandoned mine and wood treating facility investigations and remediations, and brownfield redevelopment at sites throughout the Pacific Northwest. Like I said, he's currently the program manager for the project and focuses on assisting the trust in work prioritization and planning. Another speaker is Tony Wesche. Tony is a professional engineer with Pioneer Technical Services in Kellogg, Idaho. He graduated from Montana Tech, again, Go Diggers, with a Bachelor of Science in General Engineering. Tony has over 19 years of full-time experience in the mining and remediation market sectors. And then the final speaker in this 4-part series is Tausha Miller. Tausha is a professional engineer and project manager with CDM Smith. She holds a Bachelor of Science in General Engineering, civil option from Montana Tech, again, Go Diggers. And her career spanned a large repository and landfill design, mine reclamation, cost estimation, and construction management. Ms. Miller's work is focused on the Pacific Northwest, particularly in the Coeur d'Alene Trust on the Bunker Hill Superfund site. So with that, I will turn it over to the speakers. Thank you very much.
All right. Again, my name is Kyle Richards. I'm the Senior Program Manager with the Coeur d'Alene Trust. We'll give a second for the presentation to show up. There we go. Here over the next hour and a half, you're going to hear from a number of members of our team as we talk about 15 years of remediation in the Ninemile Basin of the Bunker Hill Superfund site. We're excited to be here today to share some of this with you all, as this represents a significant work completion milestone on our portfolio on the Bunker Hill Superfund site. We wanted to be able to share some of our cleanup journey, lessons learned, our management strategies, how we're measuring success, and what the future looks like on Bunker Hill. To start with a little agenda, you'll hear from myself and Alan Hughes as we talk about some of our background approach and strategies. You'll hear from Tausha on siting and design of the East Fork 9-mile waste consolidation area, where mine waste from the individual source site remedial actions has been disposed of. You'll hear from Tony Wesche with Pioneer Technical as he's going to talk about the individual remedial actions that were completed. And then we'll wrap it up with how things are looking from a success standpoint and where we're going next. So let's jump into things with some of the background on Ninemile Basin and our approach. I'm going to start by giving a quick Bunker Hill Superfund Site 101. Shown on the screen here is the approximate extents of the Bunker Hill Superfund Site. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the Montana-Idaho border. That's generally our eastern extents. From the Montana-Idaho border, the Superfund site runs down through the maroon outlines following the Coeur d'Alene River corridor, in through and including Lake Coeur d'Alene, out through the Spokane River and extending into eastern Washington. Mining started here in the 1880s and continues to present day, right? But some of what we're going to talk about today are these old historic practices that resulted in some widespread contamination throughout the area. The Bunker Hill Superfund site as a whole is one of the largest and most complex sites in the United States, spanning an areal extent of over 1,500 square miles and about 166 river miles of areas that have been impacted by past mining. The site's broken into 3 operable units. Shown in the center of the screen there, you can see a light gray outline. That's operable units 1 and 2. Work started here in the 1980s when the Superfund site was first listed on the National Priorities List. From there, the work expanded into operable unit 3. Everything outside of that 21 square mile box is operable unit 3. So that's where the Coeur d'Alene Trust does all our work. There's about 21 square miles in operable units 1 and 2. And then the other 1,400 plus square miles are operable unit 3, where our work is focused. On the right-hand side, the right-hand maroon boundary, this is the upper basin as it's referred to. This is where the historical mining practices took place. Most of those practices focused in this area, and we'll talk a little bit today about the Ninemile Basin. Am I showing? Sorry, go back. The Ninemile Basin is located just out of Wallace, Idaho. That's where we're going to focus our talks. Beyond the upper basin, we have the lower basin of the Coeur d'Alene River. Similar to some of the talks we heard earlier about downstream transport and deposition, the lower Coeur d'Alene River has been heavily impacted through downstream transport and fluvial deposition. Represents a large lead source ongoing to Lake Coeur d'Alene. Moving on, wanted to show this photo just to share a little bit more information. It's a neat photo, but also highlights what some of these older mining sites looked like in North Idaho. Again, mining started in the 1880s, quickly ramped up and continued to progress. These mine sites had to fit into these narrow canyons in North Idaho. You can see the steep topography of the adjacent hillsides with all this mining infrastructure packed into the narrow canyons. Within about a quarter mile of this photo here, there were 5 different mining operations, and that continued throughout many of the tributary side drainages to the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River. On the lower left-hand side, there is a creek hiding in that photo. Some of those old mining practices discharge their mine waste directly into those adjacent water bodies, allowing for downstream transport and contamination of areas not immediately associated with the individual mines themselves. So how does the Coeur d'Alene Trust fit into all of this? The trust was formed in 2009 as part of a settlement agreement between the United States and ASARCO. Part of that settlement agreement included a provision for creation of the successor Coeur d'Alene Custodial and Work Trust. So we're the successors to ASARCO, managing their environmental responsibilities with EPA as the beneficiary of the Coeur d'Alene Trust. There's some benefits to the trust model. We've heard folks talk about trusts in the past here, but those initial financial resources that were obtained as part of the settlement agreement, they didn't just go into the federal government. They went into third-party trust who could manage and invest those funds, growing them into the long term and expanding the work capabilities of the trust. The initial settlement amount was for about $436 million, and those resources have continued to grow, expanding our work capabilities within the Bunker Hill Superfund site. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan, and he's going to talk about Ninemile a little bit more.
Thank you, Kyle. So yeah, we're going to focus on Ninemile. Kyle started out with there. In 2010, EPA prioritized this basin in the South Fork for work to start. It was one of the largest loaders in the upper basin, and it was also fairly unpopulated. So it was a nice spot to start, so we didn't have a lot of people around. And the yellow polygons here, those are mine and mill sites that were in the basin. There's about 18 of them. And then there's 6 miles of riparian that was also impacted. And, these sites, a lot of these mine and mill sites are hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of waste, with creeks and tributaries running through them, next to them and eroding them. And so constant metals going into the system. So when we started looking at developing the work plans to do work out here, we were looking at the data that existed for a lot of these sites, and there was little to no data. especially with soil. There were some infrequent water samples, but we've really figured out that when we got out there, we're going to have to figure out nature and extent of the contaminants, understand the conceptual site models for all of these sites, how is the impacts moving through the system, and then how much waste was there. There were some estimates from the record of decision amendment, but we didn't know how accurate those were, especially with little to no data up there. So initially, what our plan was to go out and understand where this waste could be placed, what kind of infrastructure was needed, and then start assessing kind of from top to bottom, so we could pretty much work from top to bottom, so we were worrying about recontamination. And all of these sites really are interconnected. As we started getting out there and looking at the data, there's not like contamination starts here and stops there. Once you have a mine site, it runs the entirety of the basin. So as Kyle mentioned, the very steep V-shaped valleys here, a lot of the mine waste is at angle of repose. So when we got out there, started doing our investigation, one of the main first steps is get out there and get surface soil samples using XRF and lab confirmation, and then going in with borings or test pits to understand the subsurface and how deep contamination went. We installed a lot of monitoring wells to understand the water levels, concentrations of metals in the water, where were these mine piles impacting that, and then where were they actually in contact with groundwater. A lot of these piles actually end up being fairly high and dry. And then a lot of surface water samples to understand too how things were changing down through the system. A couple lessons learned here. The XRF, we were just doing kind of an in situ method, worked wonderfully until we got saturated materials, which makes sense. And for drilling, we tried a lot of different methodologies, but really settled on sonic. I mean, it gave us continuous cores, and we could really look at the stratigraphy and understand metal concentrations as we went down. No, I don't know how to move my notes here. Hold on a second. Make sure I got it all. And I guess with that in mind, the real steep valleys and these mine waste piles at angle of repose, it did make it really difficult to get really good characterization. So I think Tony and Tausha will talk about this later, in really having to have flexible designs with this limited data and flexible agreements with contractors so that you could make changes in the field easily. So in 2011, 2012 is when we really started getting out there and getting data. I think to our surprise, there were sites that were cleaner than others and some that were dirtier. And it really made us think about this top to bottom approach. This is a picture of the Success Complex, a very productive mine in Ninemile. And we found this one to be about 50% of the metals load to the entire basin. And it was also used very heavily for recreational purposes. So in consultation with EPA and talking through with them, the decision was made to actually leapfrog a few sites and get down here and clean this one up, since it was such a high risk and such a high loader. And so once we started understanding that, we were adaptively managing every year, kind of looking at the new data that we were receiving and really thinking through prioritization and how we wanted to move through this. And so we developed some factors that allowed us to kind of talk this through with EPA. And so I'll go through those real quick. One of them, obviously, metals loading. This image to the right is a blow up of a figure that shows peak and base flow, lead and zinc loading from each of these, whether it's an individual site, point source, or stretch of creek. But we were looking at that to find those largest loaders. Location was also important. We still wanted to work top to bottom the best we could, so we didn't have to worry about recontamination. And predecessors, was there infrastructure in place to access some of these? Where we have to build roadways? Was there waste consolidation area space available for a large site? So we had to think through those, and then cost. The trust is operating in an annual budget, and we had to make sure that the amount of work we were going to do was going to fit within any given year. And then the last factors, human health, access to these sites. We really had to look at that. Were people recreating on these? Was it high use, low use? Were the residents nearby? 9 Mile was kind of easy, but as we get into other basins, it's a little more difficult. Site grouping, if there's sites adjacent to one another, obviously there's efficiencies there to be gained by doing them together. And then obviously erosion potential. So I think with all of those factors in mind, we started thinking about prioritization. So I'll turn it back to Kyle.
Musical chairs here. So Alan talked about there's a number of factors that we're thinking about as we're prioritizing sites. But beyond just considering an individual site and whether it's a higher priority or a lower priority for immediate cleanup, we utilize a 10-year tool where we're looking at project schedules and sequencing and balancing this work within our annual budget. So the figure that's shown on the screen here is less consequential from the individual colors to what it represents. And what we're looking at is how do we sequence, given the volume of work that's ahead of us, how do we sequence all of these projects, the characterization, the design phases, and the construction phases to keep constant work going from a cleanup perspective. Some of the things that we're thinking about beyond those individual character or prioritization factors are consistent workflow, right? On an annual basis, we want a little bit of investigation going on. We want a little bit of design. And we want the majority of our annual work budget to be spent on remedial action cleanup work. The other thing that we need to be thinking about that a 10-year horizon helps us to look at is as one project is getting cleaned up and construction is completed, we want the next one ready to roll into line. So understanding at what point in time we need to start our characterization and design process so that that workflow keeps going. The darker red bars that are shown here represent construction schedules. So you'll see that as one's completed, the next one's ready to roll, and we just keep moving down the line. From a balanced budget standpoint, as Alan noted, we work under annual budgets. We currently work under about a $30 million annual maximum budget. So cost has to factor into our prioritization, not only from an annual work plan basis, but longevity of the trust and what our long-term costs and spending look like, managing all of that within our financial resources. The other thing is that as one project moves, you have a change in prioritization. This tool allows us to be able to quickly move things around and understand how that's going to impact different project schedules as we have to operate within those EPA-approved budgets. Stakeholder input, something that I skipped over is EPA is the sole beneficiary of the Coeur d'Alene Trust. So they're involved closely with us in this process. Looking at a 10-year horizon allows us to get aligned with EPA on our short-term, mid-term, and long-term priorities. Where are we going to be working immediately? Where are we working in 5 years? And where's that taking us 10 years out? And then finally, adaptive management. I mean, I don't mean to just use it as a buzzword, but this is not a set it and forget it process for us. We're constantly incorporating new information into this, whether it's information gained from our characterization projects or scope refinement, cost refinement. All of that's feeding into how we keep this consistent workflow moving and continue to complete projects. So to wrap up the first part of this session, our work started in 2011 to begin our source site characterization. We utilized that data to inform our cleanup designs, but we also identified a need for a longer-term planning tool that we continue to use to this day, and that's our 10-year priorities. We also knew that there were limited areas of data collection, so our designs, both on the remedial action side as well as on the waste consolidation side, would need to be flexible as new information became available, and we needed to expand or change our waste consolidation needs. And Tausha Miller is going to talk us through how CDM helped us to navigate adaptive management of some waste consolidation area.
Thank you, Kyle. As Kyle and Alan mentioned, my name is Tausha Miller. I am a project manager with CDM Smith out of our Kellogg, Idaho office. And I know we've got a 4-part session here, and I'm sure you guys are just itching to ask Alan and Kyle all sorts of questions about their first part. But if you guys can bear with us, hold until the very end when we're done with part 4, we'd be happy to answer all your questions. So Also, I know this is after lunch here and everyone is probably getting a little groggy and tired. So I have lots of photos in here to help you keep you guys entertained. So bear with me. So we've identified all of these kind of source sites in the 9-mile basin. And we know that that's where we want to start. But with that, where do we go from here? So we have all these waste rock and tailings deposited high in that 9-mile basin. What's our solution? What are we going to do with all of those piles? And this is where the East Fork 9-mile waste consolidation area, or as we affectionately call it, the WCA, comes into play. So the solution is that we're going to pick up all of those source sites and we need to deposit it somewhere. And we know that generally the best solution to that is to place it high and dry, somewhat centrally located within this basin next to all these source sites. So we've got our list of criteria here in order to select where that location needs to go. We know it needs to be close to all these source sites, as I mentioned. It needs to be large enough to contain all of the material. So we're looking at potentially 1 million to 3 million cubic yards of capacity. As Kyle mentioned, we need to be flexible with that design, and we need to make sure that whatever location we select, it's got ability to phase that site in. Another bonus would be existing access roads. Is there anything present there so that we don't have to go and build new infrastructure? Also the potential for clean borrow materials. So that would be topsoil for covering not only the WCA, but at each individual RA site, as Tony's going to get into. And rock would be a bonus. So is there any sort of rock development area at a particular location, again, to fulfill that clean borrow source? We would also really like it to be free of complex land ownership issues. The last thing that we need is to come into a site that's got 10 or 12 different property owners that are really sensitive. So that's a criteria to keep in mind. And then we need it to be relatively flat. We've got a lot of waste that we need to stack in here. So if it's located alongside a mountain or several drainages, that's not going to be great. We need to place this waste at roughly a 3-to-1 slope. So this is all of our criteria. And here's a little bit more of a zoomed in map of the 9-mile basin and all of these particular source sites that we've identified. You can see Tony's going to kind of talk about all of these, but here's 5 right off the bat. So we know we kind of generally need to be somewhere within this zone. So now that we've got our criteria, we need to go find the spot, right? So what are our best ways in order to go and find that spot once we've got our criteria here? So site selection tools. We started looking at LiDAR data that was available. Plain old Google Earth. Google Earth has great capabilities these days, so let's start there. And of course, the best thing that you can do to go and see if a site is feasible is get your boots on the ground. Let's go and do a site visit. So here's 3 kind of general photos from each of those different criteria of where we ultimately decided to select the spot for the WCA. So now we've got our spot. And this is just generally it on a topographic map here. Referring back to our site selection criteria, we found that there was a 1-owner property. It had an existing access road network to it. There's lots of old logging roads in the area, so we could build upon that existing infrastructure. And right off to the left-hand side, you can kind of see a peak. We identified that that would be a great spot for a quarry. You could see bedrock kind of poking out amongst all the trees. Did some exploration and found that that would be a perfect rock source. And actually looking at, based on elevations and this topographic map here, we thought, we could generally get about 400,000 yards of material out of that one peak. And also we saw that this was relatively flat. It's got a large enough area right there in the middle as a good base to build upon. And we know in that base that we can borrow soil material as we strip that foundation and build upon it. We've got potential for 200,000 yards of soil. Once we had that site, we dig a little further into a slope stability analysis, or started looking at a slope analysis. And there's 2 areas here to call in mind that are circled here. And they are 2 kind of little natural drainages that were in this site. So we knew that In order to maximize this location and to get as much material here as possible, we needed to do something about those two little drainages. And what we decided to do there was to build what we call our buttresses. They provided stability to these areas. And so we basically backfilled them and bolstered those two corners again to maximize that footprint. So 2013, we got right into the design. And here is our conceptual design. We wanted to see, again, what we could do and how to maximize what our final configuration would look like. The two spots there in gray are buttresses, the north and the south buttress. We dug a little further during the design, and again, we looked at that quarry, about 400,000 yards of material, but that area was expandable, and we could get more if we needed to. And the bonus was it's completely outside of where that waste footprint would need to be. So we're not sacrificing one thing for another. Soil salvage, we estimated roughly 250,000 yards we could pull out of there, and our final capacity for waste was approximately 1.3 million cubic yards. Now we get into construction, the fun part. So I mentioned those buttresses, the north and the south buttress. This is where we needed to start. And so the photo here is of the north buttress, and you can kind of see some construction going on. The first thing that we needed to do was strip any topsoil. We built a drainage system down at the toe to make sure that we're not blocking any groundwater at the base. And then we backfilled. We developed the quarry, which you'll see here in the next slide. But that gave us about a 3 to 12 inch diameter rock or a 6 to 24 inch. And we placed that in several foot lifts and basically compacted the hell out of it. And so we took about 5 passes of a roller to get that in there nice and firm. So here is, as Kyle and Alan mentioned, phasing of the WCA is really important. So these next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk through what that phasing looks like starting after we built the buttresses and through completion through last year. So our first kind of phasing was the initial development from 2013 to 2015. After we built those buttresses, we did some topsoil stripping. We salvaged a bunch of that material, prepped the foundation, and built what we call our base drainage system. So the WCA does not utilize a bottom liner or a leachate collection system. The typical conceptual design that was identified in the ROD amendment allowed for some flexibility in what that bottom liner would look like. So given we identified we could put in a 2-foot thick layer of rock that is about a 1 to 3 inch diameter, open graded, that would allow for any groundwater that could come up to provide basically a flow path for water to get out. The ultimate goal of this, right, is to keep things dry. And so by placing that base drainage system underneath before we start placing waste, we allow for and minimize that groundwater contact with any contaminated material. That base drainage system utilizes what we call monitoring pipe trenches and secondary drainage points. So every roughly 200 feet along the slope, we install a trench that outlets on either side to the north and to the south. That is a dual protection. It helps drain that base drainage later. It's a perforated pipe, so it can collect anything that does come up through that base drainage system, route it out. And it also provides a monitoring point. So as we're going to kind of discuss later, we've been collecting data from the WCA since we've been placing material to kind of see how the WCA is performing. So those monitoring pipes and trenches allow for a data collection point to be checking in on that. And then here at the top photo, you can see this is our quarry that I mentioned. This is where we're getting all of our rock borrow material. So we started developing the material. Anything that has been produced and placed, or anything that's been placed at the WCA, or at any of these source sites that Tony's going to mention, any of that rock comes from this spot. So there were very minimal or almost none rock that was brought in from a local quarry and trucked to any of these locations. It was all developed here from the WCA's quarry. And then once we got the infrastructure built, that's when waste placement started. So the first site we started with was the Interstate Callahan, and we developed capacity for roughly 250,000 yards of material. And in this, with the WCA, infrastructure and your stockpile areas are crucial. So after we're stripping all of this material, where are we going to place it? Because we know that we have years of work that's going to occur here. It just can't sit within the zone that we're going to be placing material. So it was really important for us to identify stockpile zones and stockpile areas where we could put soil, where we could put rock for contractors to come and get as they need. So after the first 3 years of construction and waste was placed, we got into phase 2. So this is from 2016 to 2018, very similar to the first phase. We did the foundation prep, we installed base drainage system, we stripped soil, we developed the quarry even further. But what was really unique about this year was what we call our seep collection system. So during that first year, we identified up on the hill as we were salvaging our soil and preparing our base that there was groundwater that was still daylighting. And we knew that, right, ultimate goal, keep this dry. We need to do something about that. So enter our seep collection system. So we dug a 8 to 10 foot trench, put a 6-inch perforated pipe in it, basically like a French drain, routed the water out, and took care of that groundwater seep. And this theme actually kept continuing. We actually wound up chasing that same spot all the way through construction back until about 2023, or 2023. So we kind of identified the same seep and zone, throughout the year, but each, as we developed, we needed to take care of it each time. So seep collection system. The waste that came here was we developed capacity for about 400,000 yards of material from the Success Complex, which was that first photo that you saw at the title slide. And that's this nice bright orange jig tailings that you can see in the top photo being placed. All right, let's move on to phase 3. What was unique about this one from 2019 to 2020 is we start our first phase of the final cover. And so it had been about 5-6 years of waste placement at this point in time. Those monitoring pipes that I had mentioned, and we're collecting this data, we kind of started to see an uptick that got some people a little nervous, some people a little worried. So we reprioritized our implementation sequence and decided to bump up the first phase of cover installation by several years. So in 2019, we installed our first phase of cover system, which was roughly 160,000 square feet. And this is our cover system profile you see here. So we've got all of our waste that's been placed compacted. On top of that, we have a 1 foot layer of a 1-inch minus screened waste rock. So each year, this layer acts, it's got a double purpose. It's a winterization layer that we stabilize either with BFM or an acrylic copolymer. And so it acts as that component for winterization, but it's also a cushion for our geosynthetic components. So that's the second layer as we're working from the bottom of this profile up. So there's a 12-inch layer there, and then we get into our geosynthetics. We start with a 10-ounce non-woven geotextile on the bottom. And then that is followed by a 60 mil LLDP geomembrane. It's actually a specialty material. It's called Super GripNet. I think we have some agri folks in the room, so thank you for allowing us to use your product. And it's a specialty product because the nature of these slopes and where we're at in the high, spots of North Idaho, we get a significant snowpack. And with these slopes and the drainage, we needed this specialty product in order to prevent any sliding for stability purposes. This is where this specialty liner came into play. So after that geomembrane, we have for drainage, we have a geocomposite. It's a 330 mil backed on both sides by a 10-ounce geotextile that just drains anything before it hits that geomembrane. So that's the geosynthetic components, 3 layers there. Followed on top of that, that's when we get into our 3-foot layer of our aggregates or our soil. So we start with a protection material. It's 12 inches of a clean crushed gravel, 1-inch minus, again, developed from our quarry here, followed by 2 feet of a cover soil. And that's the same material that we had stripped and salvaged as we're preparing the foundation here. And then we amend it. So the top lift gets lime amended, and then we spray all sorts of organics and compost on top. And then obviously we put in a nice seed mix in there as well. We do not want there will be no planting at this site. We don't want to damage, that liner system. But this is only 3 feet down. So trees and shrubs are a no here. But we did look at native grasses to the area to, kind of keep the natural landscape of North Idaho. So after our first phase of cover, now we're moving into 2021. We had a small year of waste placement. This was from the lower East Fork 9 Mile Creek. It was roughly 40,000 yards of material, a very small year in 2021. But that was really the start and the prep for the next 3 big years of 22, 23, and 24. And those years looked again as cover system installation. So we got into phase 2, which was roughly 200,000 square feet. Same components as I just described on the prior slide. And then we did another expansion. And at this point in time, we're seeing that we're really close to the end. We've got about a year or 2 left of these sites to go clean up. And as a team, as a Coeur d'Alene Trust team, we look at what's coming in each year. And so those waste placement plans are subject to change. We don't, as you're kind of refining and taking material out, it's never going to be what you thought it would, right? There's always changes. Expect the unexpected, as someone mentioned earlier. So in 2023, we're getting close to the end, and there are 2 sites that are being remediated currently, and their projected waste volumes are going up. But our WCA did not have the capacity at the time to handle that material. So we had to go back to the drawing board quickly, figure out how can we expand this site one more time in order to allow for placement of those final materials. And in order to do that, we built a mini buttress off on our north side. That's this lower left photo here, to accommodate that increased waste volume, provide additional capacity. Last year was our final year of incoming waste receipt at the WCA. It was a milestone year. We received close to 200,000 yards of material. And so this photo here at the bottom is one of those very final days of waste placement at the WCA. It was very near and dear to all of us after 12 years, 13 years of waste placement. This was a very critical milestone that we hit. So this photo here is the conclusion of the WCA after that final waste was placed. And so it begs the question, what's next? We're done bringing in material, but what does that mean for closeout of the WCA? So the next 2 years, we'll be doing our final cap and cover over the remaining exposed waste slopes, and that looks about like 580,000 square feet. So the first phase, we were 160, second phase, just over 200. And now we're going to try and do, we are going to do the last and final phase in the next 2 years, roughly 580,000 square feet of material. So it's going to be a lot of work, but we're very, very excited about it. And as we're doing the final cap and cover here, we're also going to go and close out all those stockpile areas I mentioned. So they're no longer going to be in need. We need to go and basically do a final regrade and cleanup of those stockpile areas as well as the quarry. So we should be, site completion should be anticipated at the end of next year, 2026. So by the numbers, remember that 1.3 million cubic yard capacity that I mentioned at the very beginning? Well, our final waste number was 1,299,593 cubic yards of material. So we were right there, shy by about 400 yards. We took about 300,000 yards of soil that was and that was used for either the cover system here or for the RA sites. And out of the quarry, we took roughly 350,000 cubic yards of material. And just to give you a scale, we did about 160-foot cut, vertical cut from the top to the bottom of where it stands today. When we're done, we'll have about 23 acres of final cover over the WCA here. So here's a progression in photos. Starting at the upper left is 2013. Working to the bottom right is 2018. So just that phasing of selection of the site, starting the initial development, moving on to waste placement, continuing that expansion you can see up the hill. Final cover starting in 2019 at the upper left. Again, continuing up the hill, building basically this nice artificial mountain with the conclusion down here at the bottom right in 2024. Now, I'm sure we all do this, but it's really crucial each year that you go back and you go back to the drawing board and you say, where did we go right and where did we go wrong? What are our areas for improvement? We can always do better at something, and what are those areas? So the next couple slides, I'm just going to talk about what some of those lessons that we have learned here individually for the WCA, but also for the Ninemile team as a whole. On the planning side, that selection of the WCA provided a huge savings to the trust. It allowed for efficient placement from these RA sites because it was centrally located. It had an existing access road and infrastructure there, so we didn't need to come in and build anything new. That quarry was there and the ability to salvage all of that soil. One thing we learned was be suspect sometimes of LiDAR. So it can be a valuable tool, but in heavily vegetated areas like North Idaho, you can have, it can result in some significant volume variances in those treat areas. So we have started to clear and grub trees the prior season, then get our surveys and build off that as our design surface, because you can see some fluctuations between what is actual ground and what LiDAR is giving you. And then the pre-design and construction data collection, you know, having the designer in the room with the trust as they're looking at these sites is crucial, so we know what's coming. And then planning for the construction seasons early, getting those designs approved years in advance, as Kyle kind of showed that graph. We always want to be one step ahead of when construction is going to occur. And then obviously clearing and grubbing, as I mentioned too, performing that in the fall helps with not only survey side, but also helps with bird nesting. So if we were to go and take out these trees in the spring and there's a migratory bird nest in there, we have to wait a certain amount of time in order to go and take those trees down. We don't want to do an incidental take. Implementation. So some lessons learned on the construction side, that phasing of building the WCA save some investment income for the trust. Right, cost is extremely important, so we need to make sure that we're not upfronting and uploading a bunch of costs early, and we're making sure that we're doing that in an appropriate time frame. The quarrying rock and the salvaging of soil, using that quarry saved the trust over $10 million in trucking costs alone. So that was a huge benefit. And then it also it had another dual benefit of pollution reduction, right? We're not bringing in hundreds of trucks each day through a neighborhood, through residential areas, up the hill. You can just imagine kind of what that trucking cost would need or that trucking would take. So there was a dual benefit with that. And then what you see here in the photo, this white material, in the early years, we started for winterization. I mentioned we have this 12-inch layer of a kind of a screened crushed waste rock. We started early on by placing BFM, bonded fiber matrix, over the slopes basically for erosion control and stability. But what we were finding is that BFM was holding on to water. And what we don't want to have happen is for water to infiltrate through the waste and stay there in long periods of time. We're trying to get water to leave as quickly as possible. So after we realized that this BFM wasn't quite working out the way that we had intended, we started looking at other options. And we discovered an acrylic copolymer. We've used several different products. I think both companies are actually here, tortoiseshell, and we've also used rhino snot as well. And that's this white stuff that was placed. We spray this with a hose or a water truck. And what it does, it provides just a nice thin crust on top of this screened crushed waste rock and minimizes infiltration. It basically promotes a sheet flow off the waste. And so that has drastically helped in our loading that we've seen at all these monitoring points. And some last lessons here on the implementation side is the incoming waste volume and compaction. Updating these placement plans each year is crucial because compaction and shrinkage is really hard to estimate at these sites. So we may initially plan to receive 100,000 yards from a source site, but as it comes in, as we place it, as we compact that material, it could shrink down to a capacity of 80,000. But a different site might have a tenth of that reduction. So we don't know because these source sites, there's so much variation. Not all waste material is the same. Sometimes we get a nice jigtail type material like the Success, which was like a 1-inch minus. Or sometimes when we're working in the floodplain, we'll get wet soil that's not fully dry and that's kind of difficult to place, or we might get a bunch of riprap in there. And so there's such a fluctuation and variability in what we receive. And so not knowing, if you just have a flat assumption every year, your design and capacity for the WCA could be completely off. So it was really crucial for us to work as a team, with Pioneer and Tony and his team, and with the trust to talk about this each year, and really work together, for each of these sites, and in order to make both areas, basically to make them what they need to be, and to get our cost benefit and to close them out appropriately. So coordination with the Ninemile team there, again, was really crucial. We started meeting monthly towards the end of the design to make sure that we're maximizing what's coming in. And with that, I'll turn it over to the other half of the Ninemile team, Tony Wesche, to talk about those RA sites.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Happy to be here. I spoke, I must have been back in 2016 on the IC Rock Dump site, if you guys, the long-term people, have been here. Happy to be back to show you everything else we've been up to since that point. So as it says there, I'm going to talk through the overview of the source site design and remediation construction elements. Not going to lie, there's not a lot of engineering details in this. There's just a lot of photos, because to get through all these sites in the time frame, pictures do 1,000 words. So get to it. So as they've kind of mentioned, give you an idea where we're at in Idaho. Also the Google Earth map, each of the pins there is the different sites. As you run up through the valley there, got the WCA at the top end, IC Rock Dumps up to the left, and then Interstate Mill Site, Tamarack Complex, the Success, and then finally the Day Rock and Lower EFNM Creek. So those will be the 6 different sites I talk about today. We can't really start on the design without first talking about the basis for the designs. Each of these sites went through a 30, 60, 90, and 100% design effort. As you saw in Kyle's slides, 2-year design period to get through the EPA and the trust protocols there for the review periods that we need to get through. The main goals for each of these sites, each site may have had a separate basis of design, but trying to narrow it down to the ones that were kind of cross between all the sites. We needed to achieve final soil concentrations on site of 530 to get our full removals completed. We needed to restore the native ground surfaces back to match the existing native conditions on site. We put a lot of emphasis on restoring the stream channels out there and the floodplains and riparian areas. Anybody who's ever done reclamation work, if you don't have nice green grass growing, you could do the greatest job in the world getting rid of the mine waste, but if you're not growing grass and the stream's not flowing, you're going to have a lot of questions to answer. So as you'll see in the photos, we got rid of the waste, but we've also done a nice job, in my opinion, rebuilding the stream channels and getting the sites back grassed and treed and ready to watch them go for the next 50 years. We wanted to minimize the O&M requirements that the trust was on the hook for. The trust is on the hook for these sites into perpetuity. So we had to come up with low maintenance designs. On steep slopes, that's sometimes really tough to achieve. But through the design efforts, we were able to find good ways to help minimize that and not do anything too crazy on these slopes that put people and the workers at risk to get the work completed. Then the last one is maintain recreational use. Anybody who's been in North Idaho knows that everybody owns an ATV, everybody owns a UTV, and on the weekends, what do they love to do? They love to go spin wheelies out on waste rock piles and drive mountain roads way too fast. So we needed to keep that in place for those people. A couple of the project and design constraints. We have a very short construction window in North Idaho. By the time the snow leaves in May to June, the sites dry out. We're lucky to work June through about mid-October. A couple of years we were able to go into November. A couple of years we were able to start a little bit early, but the guaranteed window is June through about October 15th. We had very limited area on all these sites for the different just construction activities and stockpiling of materials. When you're moving the amount of materials we were moving, your contractors are always wanting flat areas to work off of. We just didn't have a lot of those. So that was a huge design constraint, a huge project constraint. Everything we were doing was on a steep slope, 1.5 to 1 or steeper. You start talking about putting dozers and how do you excavate waste on these slopes. Some of the ingenuity of our contractors to get the waste material moved out of there safely with 745 haul trucks, dozers, excavators, that kind of equipment. Pretty impressive what those guys were able to complete over the last 12, 13 years. And then also Tausha touched on it very heavily, but coordination between the design and the WCA, because the left hand's got to know what the right hand's doing, right? And so she needs to know what we were anticipating. We need to know what she's anticipating, whether it's waste stream coming in or whether it's us needing remediation soils leaving the WCA. So the first site we'll talk about is the Interstate Callahan rock dumps. We did this work back in 2014, 2015. We give you guys just a few basic metrics on it. Original design volume was 221,000 yards. Final excavation was just under 216,000 yards. We ended up placing about 27,000 yards of general backfill back on the site, constructed about 1,700 feet of Lower EFNM Creek or East Fork Ninemile Creek, and then total re-veg of 18 acres. With each of the sites, the consistent theme is these 4 metrics that I'll present. I will say with the revegetation, every site got seeded with native seed mix. We broadcast seed everything. As I mentioned with the slopes, drill seeding was completely out of the question at these sites. So when you start thinking about revegging and walking these slopes, everything was broadcast seeded and then hydromulched behind it. We did plant a mix of conifer trees at 200 plants per acre to kind of bring it back to its forest state. And all the trees we planted were just tubulings. One of the goals with the trust was to let the site, kind of reclaim itself once it was there, give it the platform, let the trees come in on their own. So get into a couple photos. So here we're looking at the upper rock dump. That top left picture is the site before. If you can imagine, out of that pile is where the tributary used to run through. And then on the right is a look shot of the reconstructed stream tributary running back down through. Bottom left is another photo, kind of in progress, as it looks like they were putting some cover soil back on the sites. In there, you've got the tributary dug out. And then, bottom right corner there is looking back up that same draw. So you can see just the the way the old miners used to do it, fill in the draws, the water would run subsurface. Makes it tough once you get down to the bottom because you are dealing with the wet saturated waste. Contractors were having to do a lot of dewatering, get a lot of, drying on the materials before it could go up to the WCA for compaction. A little different look at the lower rock dump here. That top left picture is the very head end where the waste boundary was at. So you can just see the vertical fall in that picture and what they were using as a road to get up there. Like I said, pretty impressive what they were able to do with the equipment up in that area. Looking at the bottom left, now you've got the waste dug out, so you can kind of see that valley start to take shape. As they're coming down through, start to see more of the cover soil look to the site versus the waste rock look to the site. And then the two right photos are both looking, the top one's looking straight down towards EFNM Creek, down the drainage. And then the bottom right one is looking back up with the tributary off to the left there. I'll talk a little more about EFNM Creek here. So we did a reference reach just above the Interstate Callahan here. The outcome from that was that it's a step pool system. It's a steep system. You're talking grades running 10% for these stream channels. So the idea being let the steps dissipate the energy, armor where you can to keep the bottom in place. You're not getting a bunch of head cutting back through. And then we worked with the U.S. Forest Service with the different types of steps. So we wanted to provide a number of different hydraulic approaches to the steps. So we were using wood and rock. And then we had a couple different variations, whether they were a V formation or just a log or a rock, structure across the creek. In the left photo here, you can see the logs that are in the V formation there where the water's coming right into the center. You got your downstream pool. And then once that's before, that was just water that was dewatering through the site. We hadn't turned the creek back in yet. And then the photo in the middle there, it was taken in 2022. So about 6-7 years after construction was complete. You can see the willows and the alders really coming in, how they're encroaching on the stream, bringing back in some of the shade that we expected with the stream work and with the plantings, start to get some of those ARARs for temperature and stuff like that back in line that we had to look at early on in the program. On the far right is just another look at the EFNM Creek that was constructed. Once again, you can see the willows and everything else coming through. Here we're built against the hillside. So you've got the native stand of trees off to the right where there was no waste. Provides really good shading, a lot cooler water keeps the water cooler coming down through there. So as we move down now to the next site, so Success Complex, Alan hit on the Success. This was the second site we did. It's a little lower in the valley but with the loading that it had, it was prioritized second on the list. So we began design on this one in 2014, completed it in 2015. We bid it out in 2016 and completed the site in 2019. Overall, design quantity was 404,000 yards. We ended up at 387,000 yards on the site. The big thing here was the waste on the hillside. We ran well under on the waste on the hillside because it actually came out a little bit flatter than we expected in design. But the floodplain, because of the way the floodplain worked there, we ended up running quite a bit over in our floodplain, and that, as you'll hear, kind of continued to be a common theme in the floodplains. Really tough to get good characterization data in your deep saturated soils in your floodplains. And so it did cause us towards the end some problems that kind of Tausha hit on with volumes. But we were able to work through it all and get everything up the hill. So with it, 387,000 yards off this site. We did have the one adit, the Success number 3 adit that was the largest loader to EFNM Creek on the site. We placed about 12,000 bank cubic yards of general fill. About 2,200 feet of EFNM creek was constructed, and about 14 acres total. You guys kind of saw this photo off to the left in Alan's presentation. It was one of the more majestic photos, I guess, in Ninemile before, looking at that waste rock pile success. But just kind of does paint the picture for what kind of we were up against coming down. So you could see the orange jigtails in there, but you also see the waste rock sitting over top of it. So the construction on this site, they started from the top and just worked it like a zipper, or just straight across the top, back and forth, and then they were topsoiling as they came down. So then you can see the photo in the middle, taken from the same location with, you know, the final remediation, the final creek in place. The other big thing at success we ran into in the floodplain was the majority of this channel was built on bedrock. So it was something we hadn't really encountered at the Interstate Callahan. And when you're running the stream on bedrock, there's just kind of a lot of questions. You know, what does this do for fish habitat? What's it do for these, you know, velocities within the stream? You know, is it acceptable to do that? Does it change the design, you know, to a point where, or do we need to bring the materials in to backfill the stream to make it work? So as we work through those questions, we decided the bedrock gave us a great bottom to the stream, talking the 10% grades we were, you know, dealing with. So we knew we weren't going to lose the stream to the bottom and see a bunch of head cutting. So then the question became, well, how do we build these banks so that we don't see a bunch of erosion on the bank, since it doesn't really have anywhere to cut within the middle to create, you know, sediment, to bring sediment into the system. We were worried about the banks getting eroded away as we went. But as you can see, this photo was taken about 4 years after construction. Everything is holding up strong. Another look here at the upper end of the site. You know, you can see it on the right-hand side there. That's more during a higher flow event on site. We did design all these sites to the 2.33 year flow event. So that flow must be somewhere just under that. We're about to bank full level. And then you can see in the middle photo, there's some rock channel across the middle of the site there. One of the design aspects on this site was how do we have this, you know, 400 foot long slope. How are we going to handle our stormwater coming off of this? Once again, thinking back to how do we minimize O&M on this site, putting rock channels up and down this site, getting rid of that stormwater so it doesn't cause us, one, long-term slope stability issues, but two, just we'd never be able to get back up on them to do maintenance if we had to. So we came up with this idea with the perforated pipe, and then so we kind of built them in bands across the site and then had them draining to existing drainages that were already going to be part of the site. So we were able to get rid of stormwater that way and really help our long-term slope stability out. And one of the benefits was by doing that, if we did see a little bit of a slough somewhere, it wasn't filling a channel in. So we were able to keep that pipe open all the time and be able to drain the water out and keep everything intact. So, all right, next site's the Interstate Mill site. We started this design in 2017 and 2018 was the design work. Started construction in 19. So the last year of success and the first year of the Interstate Mill site coincided together. So running two projects, that became a common theme as the prioritization that MFA and the trust were doing took over to try to maximize the amount of dollars being spent each year. So running two projects concurrently, trying to get as much work done as we could with the money the trust had available. We excavated 174,000 yards of mine waste. I think the original design estimate on this one was 142,000. But when you look at the site in the aerial photo there, you'll notice there's a huge floodplain area as part of this. And as I mentioned before, we started to see some overruns in the floodplain just because of how difficult it is to really characterize those floodplains. And so we overran on this site by about 30,000 yards. And it all came out of the floodplain. We placed about 28,000 yards of backfill, constructed a little over 1,100 feet of EFNM creek, overall revegetated 12 acres at the site. So these two pictures show kind of in progress. You can see the equipment in the right-hand photo working on top of the pile. So what made this site interesting was the Silver Valley Natural Resource Trustees had come in before. I think it was the Silver Valley Natural Resource Trustees had come in before back in the 90s. They had actually removed the waste. So where the pile's at in the center of the site there off to the left, there was waste spread across all that. They had consolidated it into one kind of on-site repository, and then they capped it with a rock cap. And it was still causing issues within the stream. You can see where the stream's at in comparison. So decision was made to go in and do a full removal and take this material up to the WCA as well. You can see the benching in the photo on the left as the contractor worked their way down the hillside to get everything removed. You can see BMPs. BMPs were a big thing along the creek that, everywhere we went on these projects, you better have your BMPs in place. We had enough issues with rain and everything else up there. We didn't need to be getting ourselves in trouble by not having our BMPs in place. So as you move to that site, kind of post remediation, you can see the same foundations there on the right-hand side. Those foundations were considered historic, so we left them in place and just kind of backfilled around them, excavated everything out that we could, and then backfilled around them. We do have a couple little stormwater channels, as you can see, coming down off the hillside there where we encountered seeps during construction. The interesting part, the Interstate Mill site was a site where, on the top end of the site, it was, from a stream standpoint, it was still running that 8 to 10% grade, but as we got to the bottom, it really flattened off. It got down into that 3% range. So as we started looking at it in construction, just with the way the excavation finalized out, it made sense to keep the drops in, but we were able to really space those out during construction and kind of get more run and more riffle in there versus just having to stack structures. Moving on to the Tamarack complex. So this was the biggest of the sites as far as the waste removal goes. We moved 413,000 yards off this site. I think original design was 390,000 yards. This was an interesting one because it wasn't necessarily EFNM Creek floodplain that caused us the issue. It was the tributary. So what you can't see in this photo on the right is that the whole tributary is running subsurface. And through investigation, it's really hard to go and probe and drill in the exact right spot to hit the bottom of these, very steep, very narrow channels. So if you drill just a little bit off and you're not hitting that in the center, that's going to throw your design off. And so what we found was we missed it by about 15 feet probably, and it resulted in about 20 extra feet vertically that we had to go down to get waste out. So we did pick up some extra waste through there as we came out. Another interesting tidbit is the pile that you see kind of in the bottom left of that photo was known as the haystack pile to all of us. As we excavated that out over the 3 years, when we got down to the bottom of it, we actually found ice, which was an interesting one. We were a little perplexed. Contractor was definitely a little perplexed. So they had to kind of dig it and then let it melt and then dig it and let it melt. Just something we hadn't really encountered up there before. So there's a good look at the haystack pile on the left, and then a good shot in the middle, just looking up the draw. None of these really give you an idea how great or how steep this canyon really is through there. The old mill site building is on the right. We did remove the lumber off of that, but left the concrete foundation, as you'll see in the next couple photos. So EFNM Creek in the left, this is where the tributary from the canyon up above comes down and ties in with EFNM Creek. So we were able to create that confluence as it exited the canyon. And then do have a couple drone shots of on the right there trying to trying to show you guys the best we can. This drainage is really hard to photo in a good angle just because it does kind of snake through there a little bit, but the drone photos is about the best way to get it. And then bottom left, the shadow doesn't do me much justice, but you can see just kind of how steep the bottom of that drainage really is, and kind of understand that I was talking about with the V part of the drainage and how the waste volumes can really adjust on you. And then the bottom right is an area up by what we've referred to as loggers camp over the last 4 or 5 years. It's just a flat area that the landowner really, he likes to camp and do whatever up there. So we're able to kind of give that back for him and still get our objectives complete. So the Day Rock and the Lower EFNM Creek, that was projects completed between 2021 and 2024. Kind of the same theme there, right? Mill site was ending in 2021. Lower EFNM Creek started in 2021 as well. Concurrent projects, and then Tamarack and Day Rock ran concurrent over a 3-year period. So trying to maximize the trust budget and the dollars available to get as much work done as we could, minimize the amount of time we were in this canyon. Overall, we excavated 375,000 yards of waste rock from this site, 130,000 yards of backfill. This was a big one for the creek. We had just about 9,000 feet of creek, and it wasn't just EFNM Creek. I should tell you guys that. This was Ninemile, EFNM Creek, and the West Fork of Ninemile. This is down where the 3 converged, where the West Fork and the East Fork came together. Just in the top end of this photo, you can see. The other thing that made the Day Rock a little more interesting was it had a lot of buildings on it, as you'll see on the next slide. But so the buildings you see here is post-construction. One of the interesting facts is that white building on the left, the stream actually in its existing state ran underneath it. They just built the building over top the creek, and that's just where it ran. So in design, we were able to move it out from underneath that and give the landowner a good spot to move their equipment around on site. So looking at it existing, you can see the big, bare areas of waste rock sitting on site. There's a good look in the middle of all the different buildings we had to contend with, most of which, with the exception of the big mill building and then the shed up on the right and the old lab building, the rest of them were all taken down as part of construction on this site. So starting to get into a little bit more of the infrastructure, up at the head end, we didn't have a lot. It was just, blow and go, get the waste out, start hauling it. Here we started to run into more of the infrastructure. We right off, the pavement on the right there in the middle photo, you can see Ninemile Creek Road, paved road, lots of people on it. So we started to get into more traffic control, stuff like that. And then once we were back off the pavement in the photo on the right, looking at Lower EFNM Creek, closer down in the valley, but still, just right there with the public. And so having to take a lot more precautions with the public being right there. Few photos here of everything once it's complete. The photo on the left is the Lower EFNM project, a couple years after construction. These are a little more recent, so the veg is still, the grasses are growing well, the plantings and stuff like that are still, starting to establish and come in, but they're there. The middle photo, you can see the mill building from the Day Rock, down there in the middle of the site and the creek running right down towards it. And then another good photo of the creek with a structure, a drop structure, and kind of a set of structures through there that you can see as we work our way out of the site here. So give you guys kind of the overall look. I know Tausha put the number up there of 1.299 million yards. Give you guys an idea, on our account, we hauled 1.565 million yards. That compacted down to that 1.3 million that she referenced. Overall, we hauled 224,000 yards of general backfill to complete the sites. We rebuilt almost 15,000 feet of creek, whether it be EFNM Creek or West Fork or Ninemile Creek, and then overall revegetated 76 acres total within the canyon or the basin. Get you guys just a few lessons learned from all the years up 9 Mile. Big one, flexible designs. If you're going to go into a mine waste excavation design, you better be ready to adjust on the fly, especially if you're going to want them to keep digging the waste out. Because everything from the creek to the road systems to the stormwater channels, as soon as that waste excavation's surface changes, all of those are going to change on the back end. So having it in mind how you're going to adjust designs based early on, if things start to go a little deeper with the waste excavation or go a little bit shallower, how it's going to change your grades, what your stream design changes to, how you're going to build that stuff. So having flexible designs, being able to adjust, kind of run on the fly a little bit. Another big one that probably doesn't get hit a lot is just making sure you got some flexible contracting mechanisms. We try to bid everything on unit rate bids, but as we, with the program the trust operates, there's always just different things going on that the contractor needs to jump in and help with. Having some time and materials money in all of our contracts was hugely beneficial because it didn't turn into change order fights. It just turned into, hey, go do this. We'll put you on T&M. If the next one, if you're going to go out and do this work, make sure you're getting rid of the saturated waste. Don't get rid of the stuff that's high and dry if you're going to leave everything in the floodplain that's wet, that's causing you the problems. So that was, as we really got into those floodplains, they caused us a lot of problems, but a lot of headache. But we're better off for getting them out of there at the end. At the start of the designs, we were using a straw mat on the slopes at the Interstate Callahan. And then as we started to accumulate all this cleared and grub material, we came up with a way to get rid of it. As you saw in a lot of the photos, we placed all that cleared and grub debris on the slopes, use it as erosion control protection. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we used Hydrostraw BFM through the majority of the sites, and they worked really great on those steep slopes. And then coordination. Like, we couldn't have done what we did without CDM. CDM couldn't have done what they did without Pioneer, and the trust couldn't have gotten what they accomplished without the two groups working together. So make sure from characterization to designs on either end, make sure those teams are coordinating and you're getting people out there that are willing to work together and get the job done for the better good. So that's all I've got. So hopefully people enjoyed it. So now Alan's going to come in and give us kind of a look after we've done all this work. How are we actually doing? What have we learned? So.
And I promise we're almost there. Thank you guys for putting up with this. I know it's a lot after we didn't quite get the breaks we anticipated. So we got about 10 minutes left here. So Kyle and I are going to go over kind of 9-mile closeout and what success looks like and where we go from here. So this is 15 years later after we started. This images up here are of 9-mile basin of the kind of the mine and mill sites. So I know at the beginning I said there was about 18 mine and mill sites that were within the record of decision amendment. And the pie graph on the left side, the green shows what we've completed, and that's 14 of them. The map on the right kind of shows the different stages that they're at. There's 4 of the sites that we actually, as we started investigating those, we found out that well, 3 of them were contaminated, 1 wasn't, but they didn't have very good access. People weren't accessing, weren't using them, they weren't eroding much, and they weren't loading much. And the trust will probably not have enough money to do everything in Bunker Hill. So because they weren't having those effects, we considered them lower priority. And so we're pausing on those for now as we complete the kind of the highest priority sites here. And so to allow the trust to move into other basins and work on higher priority sites in other basins. Once we complete all the higher priority sites, then we'll come back and say, okay, how did this recover? How's it doing? And which of the lower priority sites should the trust focused efforts on? And then the little trucks down there, there's 25 of them. Green represents the waste that was removed. The orange is what's left. This is just of the mine and mill sites. We estimate that there's about 97% of the waste associated with mine and mill sites was removed. There was 6 miles of stream. I think we got about 3 of them. So the bottom three really weren't adding much source to South Fork, so those were also deemed lower priority. And then, let's see here. And so, yeah, what does success look like? So as part of evaluating these sites and kind of the basin as a whole, EPA has the Basin Environmental Monitoring Program established that has kind of three different levels. The first level is basin-wide. So they have a number of points throughout the basin at major tributaries and along the South Fork and the Coeur d'Alene River to see how surface water and suspended sediment concentrations of metals are changing with time. Then you have the area-wide. An example of that is Ninemile. You can kind of cut that out on its own and evaluate it. And so we're looking at that from a surface water, suspended sediment concentration, and a biological perspective. Now that's not going to start until we're done with the highest priority sites and we say, okay, we're done, we're moving out, we want to see how this thing repairs itself. So we're actually starting that right now. And then the site specific, we do that for every one of the sites that we complete. We're looking at surface water and sediment and soil at those sites for at least 5 years to kind of see how they go. So this is kind of a basic schematic here. Establishing baseline, super important. You want to make sure that you have statistically significant data within your surface water so you can compare that post-construction. And so then you have your remedial action. You can have two parts of the monitoring. You have the construction performance monitoring and remedy evaluation. And so the construction performance monitoring is kind of your typical O&M, making sure the site is stable, you don't have large erosion going on, your vegetation has established, you're taking care of invasive species. If you do have any residual contamination left, that cap is in place and your human health and environmental risk is managed. This is scheduled for 30 years to do this. And I would say typically within 3 to 5 years, we don't have any major issues. It's mainly getting out there and spraying weeds so far. And so far, very successful. Remedy evaluation, this is more the chemical side of things, making sure that that loading to the creek is being reduced. This is an example of one of the graphs we've prepared. This is zinc concentrations in surface water. The two blue bars there, vertical bars, that's when construction was occurring. And so on the left side of the graph, that bottom two pair of lines are total and dissolved zinc at the upstream end of success in East Fork Ninemile Creek. And then the top two are dissolved in total at the downstream end. And you can see that delta between the two. You're getting concentrations of zinc that were doubling at least in the creek through that section. And then post-construction, you can see that those two lines have married up and they're almost on top of each other, showing that the reduction in concentration loading from that source is almost nil. And we do still have as Tony mentioned, an adit there that was a pretty large point source loader at that site. So we're doing this type of evaluation, including sediment and soil if necessary, every 4 or 5 years at a minimum. And then from the area-wide perspective, we haven't started that monitoring yet, but this kind of a neat example of the base of Ninemile. This is actually lead load over discharge, and the red and orange are the kind of historic and then what we're considering baseline data. And the blue is the data we've collected while we've been actually constructing in Ninemile. Lead typically expresses itself as total. That's the solid line. The dashed line is dissolved. And this is a logarithmic graph. So you can see that the blue line during construction, we've actually already seen decreases in the lead loading at the base of Ninemile. And then similar for zinc. Continue to see that trend of just that reduction in concentration of zinc at the base of Ninemile. So we'll be starting area-wide this year. We'll do that for 5 years, and the latter part of that will also include some biological monitoring. With that, Kyle, last couple slides.
3 more minutes, I promise. So beyond Ninemile Basin, the trust has been working in other areas of the Superfund site for the last 15 years. But where are we headed next? In the upper basin, we're going to focus our work over in what's known as Canyon Creek. This is actually just one drainage to the east of where we just spent the last hour and a half talking about in 9 Mile. Canyon Creek represents a significant loading source to the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River. Alan shared his little schematic of the metrics showing all of the different source sites in 9 Mile there. You can note in Canyon Creek, there's over double the amount of source sites that are located in Canyon Creek. So we're going to be heavily invested in Canyon Creek for about the next 10 years. We'll then begin working in the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River itself, working down through the impacted stream and riparian areas. And beyond the upper basin, we're also balancing this work in the lower basin. The schematic on the lower part of the slide here represents the lower basin. The lower basin of the Coeur d'Alene River represents the most substantial lead source to Lake Coeur d'Alene. So we've got work going on to address impacted floodplain and wetlands areas right now. And we're also putting the pieces in place to start to address the eroding riverbed and river banks of the Coeur d'Alene River to start to reduce the amount of lead that's being transported to Lake Coeur d'Alene on a daily basis. Repositories, for those of you that do this work, we talked about waste consolidation areas. As we look ahead to future work, we got repositories that we operate and maintain right now. That 10-year prioritization tool that we talked about, understanding our workflow and sequencing and where we're heading, we'll be planning and putting the pieces in place for additional repositories to handle our long-term waste management needs on the Superfund site. And then finally, human health on the Bunker Hill continues to be of utmost priority. Recreational use in the area continues to expand, primarily in the lower basin. So addressing recreational exposure risks throughout the lower basin will be a priority for the trust and EPA for many years to come. We're almost there. To wrap this all up, from where we started, it's difficult to have a clear path at the outset, but we use the information that we gained throughout years of investigation and design and construction, incorporating those lessons learned into our planning processes to adapt and address our highest priority areas. It's important that we document that process. We're documenting that through our prioritization process. As well as taking our lessons learned through our effectiveness and applying those to future remedial action work. We talked about teamwork here. It takes everybody pulling in the same direction. There's a lot of people that you didn't hear from today that are important to this work. Jim Finley and Ian St. John with the Coeur d'Alene Trust are here today. They're critical members of our team that have been a big part of the success and ongoing work on Bunker Hill. The trustee of the Coeur d'Alene Trust is the Coeur d'Alene Environmental Company, presidented by Roberto Puga. Without the support and leadership and financial management from that trustee side, the Coeur d'Alene Trust also doesn't exist. And then finally, our beneficiary over at EPA and all the remedial project managers that we work with to tackle these challenging projects. And that's it. We'll take questions now.
Hi, I have a quick question, a twofer. The first one, you kind of discussed stormwater management from the slopes and from the design of the geotextile and the compressed rock, but I was curious if there were any issues with stormwater management from the time of excavation to the time of compression and kind of the management of that, and if there are any issues around that. And my second question is the use of the acrylate copolymer, and I'm curious your guys' take on that and if there was any background research, if there was microplastics or issues with that, and if you're worried about potential PFAS monitoring at these sites later on.
Well, I'll just talk stormwater. You can have fun with the other one. So in construction, stormwater was always one of the issues we had to work through with the contractor. I mentioned BMPs, making sure those were in place. And they were always really good with rerouting everything. The one thing I didn't talk about that we had on each of these sites was a water treatment system that was a dual polymer system that also had a sand media filter and a bag filter with it. So we were able to dose the system and then pump any of our turbid waters to the system and then release it clean out to the creek. So we were able to handle our stormwater through that, along with any dewatering that we had to do in the floodplain.
Stormwater for your first part on the WCA side. So absolutely during construction, that was something that we had to think about, right? Is you've got active mine waste being placed and compacted. So stormwater controls were really important. Everything we did, we tried to route water or stormwater away. We've got all sorts of drainage channels and networks. One of our contractors has affectionately called this like a giant water management site. So, that's runoff control channels up above through our waste placement area to make sure that we kind of minimize that contact during construction. So that's the stormwater question. But as far as the acrylic copolymer, tortoiseshell or rhino snot, so I believe when we started having those issues with the BFM and we were seeing kind of some increased loading at these monitoring points, we knew that we had to kind of go back to the drawing board and figure out a different alternative. We did not, and some of those alternatives that we looked at were like a temporary cover. Like what if we went and put a plastic liner over everything that was exposed? That gets really expensive and really difficult really quick. So we kind of knew that was not an option. So it's through presentations and conferences like this that you get exposed to new alternatives and new ideas. And we had heard along the way at some point through other projects and through conferences like this about tortoiseshell, rhino snot, this kind of copolymer that's used a lot for like dust control and stabilization on roads. And we thought, why not try that? And so we had looked kind of at some case studies, looked at product data, talked to these manufacturers, gave them our what we're doing to see if this would help. And so we that first year we did a test plot system. So on some exposed material, we tried a variety of different methods. How do we want to spray this? How do we want to place it down? What kind of mixture are we looking at? Kind of dilution ratios until we found something that worked. And we started with just mixing it into the top couple inches, but that took time and additional dollars, and we weren't seeing the effectiveness that we wanted. And so then we tried a topical application and we diluted it less. And that has seemed to hold up over the years. And we've kind of seen that through monitoring as well. And you can get out there as soon as this is done, and it's kind of like walking on ice. It's a slick surface. You can try and chisel at it, and it takes a second for it to kind of cure, but you can clearly see a nice top film on this material. But as far as the PFAS and monitoring question, I don't think we've brought that up and have really considered that. The product data hasn't led us to that conclusion, but I know those reps are here, and I might pass and punt that question to them. So.
One last one there, it looks like.
I gathered from the presentation that you are capping many of these sites, at least I presume, the nastier stuff. And yet it looked like some of the slides you were allowing reforestation, trees to come back in. Is there a problem with penetration of that cap and ultimate failure of it?
So as Tausha talked about, there's a liner system on the waste consolidation area where long-term O&M will include removal of trees. Where you're seeing the reforestation out on the source sites themselves, those were essentially complete removal sites. So there's not the concerns on those locations that any geotextile or geosynthetic cap is going to be impacted. So essentially complete removals on the source site side, and then we'll manage the tree growth at the waste consolidation area into the long term.